I used up most of my good lines earlier, so I don't know if I have much left to say. No, honestly, I really appreciate being here in this setting. Thank you to Salesforce. It's amazing to look out because I feel like what we're celebrating here is kind of big ideas and potentially transformative change. And some of that is going to be led by corporations as well as by great chefs. And so it's the perfect setting. I want to bring your attention to maybe a few big ideas that we learned along the way in this voyage of discovery. The first is that how ingredients are produced is more important than what the ingredients are. And so I'm going to revisit that, but maybe take a second and just think about that. Beef can be part of the problem. Beef can be part of the solution. And so really just thinking about healthy soil and how ingredients are produced, I think a lot of us don't really know as chefs and cooks. And so this is an important thing to consider. And then, like, really the big idea that has inspired our work in the last couple years is that scientists, specifically biogeochemists, have determined that good farming can create durable soil carbon, long-term carbon. Good farming can take atmospheric greenhouse gases and restore it as healthy soil. And not just like a little bit. I think we've sort of known that it could happen a little bit at a time. Science has confirmed that it happens very quickly, that there's not diminishing returns as fast as we thought, and that it stays in the soil for a very long time. And so the bottom line, if you can believe it, is that good farming can reverse global warming. And so I'm going to try to say that over and over just to make everybody used to that idea, because it's kind of a new idea, because it's based on new science. And so if you didn't know that, it's not your fault, because the paper just passed in August 2018, like just passed peer review. And so good farming can reverse climate change. And so I think part of the question is, what do we do with that information? And so I would argue that restaurants can and must drive the change, but that sourcing well is not enough to change the system. And I'll get into that. And then I want to bring your attention to the fact that the state of California is taking major action, and that great chefs around the world can help lead this movement. So here's some press pieces about this and some scientific journals and different stuff. I'm happy to send you the world's densest email with all this kind of information and links and stuff. And I'm also happy to sit down with anyone and talk about it over a beer. But I want to just point out a couple things, like the new plan to remove 1 trillion tons of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. So that's the scale of the problem. And science is showing that good farming can solve the problem at that scale. Science Advances magazine, the potential of agriculture to lower global surface temperatures. Again, that's science speak for what I've been saying, which is that farming can reverse global warming. Drawdown. Food and land use represents 45% of the atmospheric carbon that needs to come out of the atmosphere to solve global warming, and it would be at a tremendous savings to society. $908 billion in cost would create $11.2 trillion in savings globally. So it's an economic opportunity for restaurants, for corporations, for everybody, and we just need to embrace that and make it happen. And that 45% is actually before these biogeochemical breakthroughs that I'm referring to. And then the last one, a mere 2% increase in carbon content of the planet's soils could offset 100% of greenhouse gas emissions. And so I would like to make the case that we need to think about farm to table not as, framed around delicious, fresh and local food and nutritious food, which it is, but as essential at all levels and across every food business to solve the problem. And chefs and restaurants must be part of the solution, not just because it's a big problem and because we're part of the food system, but because chefs are uniquely positioned to make the cultural change that needs to happen at scale. So thank you to the Basque Culinary Center and the Basque Culinary World Press for bringing this attention to the top tier of the food system. So as a chef and restaurateur, I mean, I know the challenges as much as anybody. We had a restaurant called the Perennial dedicated to championing these kinds of farming. We were sourcing beef from Lauren Poncho, who you'll hear from later today. We had a whole animal butchery program and all this stuff. And, we closed in February. It's very challenging. And so I know that there are real world trade-offs. And we can't all be Jose Andres. So the restaurant industry is almost $800 billion, and the US restaurant industry is huge. So in the US, it's 1 out of 10 workers are in food service. So in addition to just quite a lot of people and quite a lot of money, I would argue that the cultural capital that chefs possess is immense and also the most agile. So if the chefs in this room work on this movement, it becomes a global movement. So how do we make this cultural change? So I've just stated that we ran a restaurant dedicated to sourcing well, sourcing hyper well. I am a firm believer in sourcing as well as you can possibly source. But that in some ways only affects 1% of restaurants. It only affects 1% of farmland. And so we need a system that can work for every restaurant and every acre to become part of the solution. And so we've started to refer to this kind of transition that needs to happen as a shift towards renewable farming. And it's kind of drawing on the same concepts as renewable energy where, maybe you don't put solar panels on your roof, but you're contributing to improve the grid, maybe a few dollars a month. And we need these kinds of convenient solutions that are accessible to every business and every chef and every restaurant. And so non-renewable farming has removed soil carbon, the living things from the soil, and released them into the atmosphere. And good farming can put them back in the soil, but not just in an abstract, pastoral ideal way, in an actual real world solving global warming way. And so that's the new science that I think we need cultural shift and economic frameworks to support. Because if you think about just sourcing well, I'm going to kind of go down a wormhole for a second, but we run restaurants. So if you pay the farmer an extra $1 for the cherry tomatoes that are really good, it ends up being $4 on the menu, after tax and tip. Then maybe that's like $5 or $6 coming out of the consumer's pocket. That $1 to the farmer, maybe if he didn't sell it to you or she didn't sell it to you, sell it to someone else. Maybe they only got 80 cents. I don't know, making stuff up. But so that 20 cents of benefit to the farmer is $6 from the consumer. And then how many years would it take that farmer to collect 20 cents at a time before they're taking over more land and applying more good stewardship? This is the current lever for change. And it's the same lever that has failed to move organic beyond 2% of acres. And so while I believe firmly in sourcing well, I'm also pretty sure that it won't create the kind of change that we need to solve global warming as quickly as we need to solve it. And so the approach that we're advocating must be accessible to every restaurant and translate every dollar from the consumer to actual change. And so the state of California has pledged to go carbon neutral by 2045. So this is a very ambitious goal. It's the world's 5th largest economy and totally carbon neutral, not just renewable energy. And one way that they're strategizing to get there is by taking advantage of this incredible opportunity that agriculture and working lands presents. And so there's an existing program that's been around for a few years called the Healthy Soils Program. It's literally paying farmers to implement climate beneficial practices. And so I don't have enough room and it's a little bit in the weeds, but you can see like a little snapshot from the CDFA page. Some farmer doing certain practices gets paid by the state about $50,000. They put in $26,000 of their own. New soil science, kind of a modeling tool from Colorado State and the USDA allows the state to estimate the amount of carbon that comes out of the atmosphere. So it's 630 tons per year for implementing the practices. I didn't have room to put the practices, but they're basically good farming practices like compost application, cover cropping, reduced tillage, managed grazing, planting hedgerows, and things like that. It's also often referred to as carbon farming, and so that whole suite of practices would be like a farmer's carbon farm plan. 630 tons per year is the same as not burning 71,000 gallons of gas per year. And so I think you can start to see like a very clear through line between carbon coming out of the atmosphere, going back in the soil, and solving global warming. And I think it also sort of just makes sense. Like we understand that planting trees is absolutely great for, reversing climate change, and improving soil health basically is accomplishing the same thing as planting trees, but instead of a tree trunk, a big fat tree trunk representing a lot of embodied carbon, it's tons and tons of healthy microbiology and organic matter in the soil. And so if we've systematically essentially killed the soil and stripped that from the soil and put it in the atmosphere, putting it back in should solve it. The problem with this program is simply that it's radically underfunded. And that's not the state's fault because it's a brand new program. And there's legislation in like 20 other states starting to move in this direction. But so the program used to have $5 million in funding. This year, Governor Newsom increased it to $28 million, which really speaks volumes, especially in a shrinking pool of greenhouse gas reduction funds that the state has available. And so they're really focused on healthy soil and making healthy soil a priority. And that's important because California is such a big agricultural state. I forget the numbers, but it's like 2/3 of all the fruits and nuts in the US or whatever. So in the fall, we'll be working with the state of California to launch a restaurant program called Restore California. And basically, state and local governments, and hopefully corporations like Salesforce and Google and Facebook, will support the participating restaurants. The restaurants will agree to either go carbon neutral through the work that we've been doing at Zero Footprint, or to simply add a 1% charge. Money from that will go directly to implement these kinds of practices on farms. And the healthier soil will produce more nutritious food, more delicious food, conserve hundreds of millions of gallons of water, and increase our state's climate resilience. Thanks. And so if you're running a restaurant and you're not in California, the way that we've devised to kind of have a marketing framework and a way for people to recognize how to be part of the solution is to be carbon neutral. And so, this can probably best be thought of as a way to understand what it would mean to do your part. And so these are some restaurants that are carbon neutral already by contributing to renewable farming and renewable energy projects. And there's a bunch that are in progress, and hopefully a bunch more through this conversation today, as well as the pledges from the jury. And so what does it mean to be carbon neutral? A restaurant does a life cycle assessment, and again, this is basically helping you to identify what it would mean to do your part. You get a total carbon footprint, and you get a breakdown of sort of like the ingredient use and the energy use and all these things. Our partner on this work is a company called 3 Degrees Inc., and so they've now done 50 restaurant life cycle assessments. They're a B Corp, and they work with really credible corporations like Apple, and they help to Lyft go carbon neutral, and they help to Etsy make their shipping carbon neutral, and they work with 84 government agencies. And so it's definitely credible. We're not the environmental analysts or scientists. We turn it over to 3 Degrees. But so they tell you, your carbon footprint and kind of create a report that allows you to make changes. In a lot of cases, these changes might be simple things like switching to renewable energy, reducing your use of factory farmed beef. In some cases, it could be things like a restaurant in DC, Bresca, significantly lowered their impact by collecting all the animal fats and using a little bit less butter. And so it's just, it's work around the margins and it's conservation that is meaningful. But the really big part is basically making contributions to change farming. And I think that, in almost every single case we've studied, adding a surcharge of 1% is enough to offset the entire restaurant's carbon footprint. So basically, just to review, healthy soil is not really funded by capitalism at the moment. And so I think what we're talking about is, now that the science shows the potential of healthy soil, can we as chefs and restaurateurs and leaders in the food system work together to create the cultural shift that is necessary to create a renewable food system? And so after telling one chef that I met all about this program and all the science and all these things, he basically took in all the information and then looked me in the eye and said, so it's basically 1% to unfuck the planet. And I think that is exactly how we as chefs can think about it. So next is my friend and incredible rancher, Lauren Pancha, and he'll be talking kind of about these specific farming practices and ranching practices. And before he launches in, I just want to give you a few numbers. So through Zero Foodprint and 3 Degrees, the environmental analysts contacted Lauren's rangeland ecologists and different people measuring the soil carbon. And so on his 350-acre plot that started carbon ranching in 2013, and he's probably added more acres since then, the environmental benefit from changing how he was ranching on that 1/10 of his ranch took in as much atmospheric carbon as not burning 1 million gallons of gas. So that's 1/10 of Lauren's ranch at that time, and it's 1/2 millionth of the land that is currently available for grazing cattle in the US. And so I'd urge you to think of this not as, a solution for just like the amazing carbon rancher, but also a solution for the cows and calves that are on land before they go into the feedlot and before they end up in the burger at McDonald's or Shake Shack or wherever. This is a solution for every level of the industry, and there's other examples for other ingredients.
Thanks, buddy.
Thanks.
Proud of you.